Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the International Law and UN Committees of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York and the Association, I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion, which will discuss whether President Biden should endorse former President Trump's decision to have the United States recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara in return for Morocco normalizing its relations with Israel. I'm Katlyn Thomas, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. But before we begin this discussion, I would like to give you some details about the history of the dispute over Western Sahara. For our purposes, the story of Western Sahara begins in 1974, when it was a colony of Spain that had been put on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories whose people were entitled to self-determination under international law. And that year, Spain agreed to allow the UN to organize a referendum under which the people of the territory, called Saharawis, would be able to determine their future. However, before that referendum could take place, Morocco and Mauritania, which claimed the territory on the basis of alleged ties between the people of the territory and their rulers in pre-colonial times, convinced the United Nations to postpone the referendum in order to allow them to prosecute their claims before the International Court of Justice. In 1975, two things happened. First, the United Nations sent a commission to the territory to ascertain the wishes of the people. And the commission reported that there was overwhelming support for independence and not integration with either Morocco or Mauritania, and also support for an independence movement called the Polisario. Second, the decision of the International Court of Justice was issued, rejecting both the claims of Morocco and Mauritania and upholding the right of the people of the territory to self-determination. Despite these developments, King Hassan II of Morocco decided to organize a march of thousands of civilians to the border of Western Sahara, who would be instructed to infiltrate it and claim it for the kingdom unless Spain agreed to withdraw. In late 1975, Spain agreed to withdraw and to allow Morocco and Mauritania to exercise control over the territory. Morocco and Mauritania immediately sent their armies into the territory. This caused approximately half the civilian population to flee the cities and seek asylum in refugee camps in Algeria, where they remain to this day. It also began a 16-year war with the Polisario. In 1979, Mauritania withdrew from the territory and renounced its claims. But the war escalated between Morocco, aided by the United States and France, and the Polisario, aided primarily by Algeria, until 1990, when the United Nations Secretary General convinced the parties to agree to a plan under which the United Nations would conduct a referendum whereby the native Saharawis would be able to choose between independence and integration with Morocco. And there would be a ceasefire in order to allow this referendum to take place. In 1991, a United Nations peacekeeping mission called MINURSO was created, whose mandate was to conduct this referendum. However, problems soon developed, and the mission's activities were halted in 1996, only to resume again after the appointment of former United States Secretary of State James Baker III as the special envoy of the Secretary General to Western Sahara. The proceedings of the missions continued until 1999, when a provisional list of voters eligible to participate in the referendum was published. This list excluded many of the applicants put forth by Morocco. Shortly after this, Morocco withdrew from the referendum process. Baker offered several plans to enable the process to continue, but none of these plans was approved by both the parties and the UN Security Council, and in 2003, Baker resigned. At that point, the emphasis of the Security Council shifted from enforcing the plan to have a referendum to encouraging a negotiated solution to the dispute. The Moroccan government, for its part, offered a plan under which the people of Western Sahara would have a form of autonomy within the Moroccan state, but no option of independence. The Polisario, on the other hand, continued to support the idea of a referendum and refused to accept any option that would preclude the possibility of independence. Despite a series of meetings between the two parties and others, this stalemate has remained and was the position of the parties as of the date former President Trump decided to have the United States recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the territory. This makes the United States the only country which has done so and will affect the process currently before the United Nations Security Council. We have with us today several noted experts on this issue. The discussion will be divided into two panels. The first panel will discuss the legal issues involved in the underlying dispute over Western Sahara and former President Trump's decision. The second panel will discuss the policy issues involved in this decision. The first panel includes Sandra Babcock, clinical professor of law at Cornell University Law School, who is an expert on international law. In partnership with a coalition of organizations, her clinic has filed reports with United Nations committees concerning the rights of the Western Saharan people to self-determination, human rights, and other civil, political, economic, and cultural rights. Roger S. Clark, who is the Board of Governors Professor of Law at Rutgers University Law School and an expert on global issues that include the unlawful use of aggression to obtain territory, decolonization, international human rights, and the law applicable to US foreign relations and national security, among others. And Eugene Kontorovich, who is a professor at the Anton Scalia Law School at George Mason University and director of the Law School Center for the Middle East and International Law. He has written a number of articles on the subject of Western Sahara for law journals and other periodicals, including the opinion article, "Trump was right to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara," in Newsweek on December 24th, 2020. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to give initial remarks, after which I will ask each of them to respond to the remarks of the other panelists and answer questions. I will now hand the discussion over to the panelists, with Professor Babcock speaking first. Professor Babcock.
Unmute.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's really an honor to be here with so many distinguished panelists to talk about an issue that I think many of us are very passionate about. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the two panels today is that you see that it spans the political spectrum. And one of the things that I have always found so remarkable about the issue of Western Sahara is that it is known to so few people, but to those who have really spent time in the region, who know the actors involved, and who have studied it, it arouses a certain degree of both, I think, disbelief that the international community has allowed the situation to continue as it is for so long, and also sort of a dogged determination to see through this, what is in actuality the last colony in Africa. Western Sahara has been called the last colony with good reason. This introduction that you've heard by Ms. Thomas is a very concise recitation of a history that is not in dispute. And that is also, I think, something that is worth emphasizing here. The history that you heard is not in dispute. And the facts that I'm going to talk about here that underlie the right to self-determination that has been denied the people of Western Sahara for so long is not in dispute. So what we're going to talk about here today in this first panel is some of the international legal principles that undergird the rights of the Western Saharan people, and the continuing violation, at least from my perspective, and I believe from Professor Clark's perspective, Morocco's violation of international law by maintaining its occupation and by depriving the people of Western Sahara of their right to self-determination. Now, the right to self-determination is something that has, I think, been subjected to a lot of it's a topic that arouses a lot of controversy and debate because I think it's misunderstood. We hear a lot of independence movements, and we talk about self-determination of peoples in, say, Catalonia, southern Spain, in Kosovo. We'll talk about self-determination. People throw around that term to describe various independence movements, but that's different from the situation that we have in Western Sahara. Well, Western Sahara is a non-self-governing territory that was subject to colonial occupation. And under international law, as repeatedly affirmed by multiple UN bodies, including the ICJ, including the UN General Assembly, and various human rights bodies, the people of this non-self-governing territory, that is the Western Saharans, are entitled to determine their political future. This is a very basic principle of international law. And when we are talking about self-determination in this context, there really is no legal dispute in international law over their right to choose their political future. Now, the right to exercise self-determination doesn't mean that it has to be an independent state. It doesn't have to be any one particular future. What is really critical is that right, that untrammeled right to choose. That is the thing that has been denied the Western Saharan people. You heard, should I call you Professor Thomas or Ms. Thomas?
Me?
Yes.
I'm neither a professor nor a Ms. You can call me Katlyn.
Katlyn, thank you. What Katlyn has so eloquently explained is that there is a referendum, a process for a referendum that was put in place by the 1991 peace agreements that Morocco has never allowed to take place. And you will hear in Morocco's recitation of events leading up to the various efforts at organizing referenda that will be discussed, I imagine, by the second panel, various subterfuges and recasting of the facts that are simply not based in reality. The reality is that Morocco has prevented the referendum from taking place because Morocco knows that if the Western Saharan people were given the right to choose, they would not choose to be integrated into the country of Morocco. Morocco believes that Western Sahara is part of this historical kingdom of Morocco. And it has acquired the territory by force, which Professor Clark will discuss, in violation of international law. And now, because of this proclaimed sort of historical connection between Western Sahara and Morocco, it has acquired this territory and now seeks to retain it as part of its sovereign territory. But this is simply a violation of international law. The problem with the MINURSO referendum is going to be addressed, I think, more completely by the second panel. So I'm not going to go there, except to say that one of the problems with the way that Morocco has tried to organize the referendum has to do with its transfer of Morocco's civilian population into Western Sahara. So much like Israel has done in the West Bank by sending settlers into the West Bank to establish settlements, Morocco has transferred its civilian population, first in the Green March that Katlyn described, and then later on by encouraging Moroccan citizens to live in the occupied Western Sahara. It has now created a situation where settlers outnumber native Western Saharans. This transfer of the civilian population also violates very clear-cut principles of international law. And it's one of the ways that Morocco has sought to undermine the rights of the Western Saharans to that untrammeled right to choose their political future by claiming now that Moroccan settlers should be given equal voice in determining whether or not Western Sahara should align itself with Morocco or not. So I think I'm going to stop there, and because I know that we're going to hear some different opinions, and I'd like to leave adequate time for questions. And I'm looking very forward to hear what my panelists have to say.
Thank you, Professor Babcock. We'll now turn to Professor Clark.
Thanks a lot, Katlyn, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's an exciting thing to do, and I'm pleased with the company that I find myself in. You asked me to talk about the UN norms on aggression in the context of Western Sahara. And I realized, of course, thinking about that one of the significant things that lawyers do is characterize issues. How do we formulate arguments on this particular issue? And I think it's fair to say that most of the discussion of Western Sahara has proceeded along the lines that Sandra says, yes, think about it as a self-determination issue. And I think there's a good historical explanation for that, which was in Katlyn's talk. The General Assembly forced Spain's hand after it joined the United Nations to fess up to owning colonies. And one of them it owned up to owning was Western Sahara. And so it came on the list of non-self-governing territories. And we tended to think about it that way. What you asked me to do, though, was to think about it another way in terms of aggression. And I confess that I had thought about it, frankly, since the 1970s, when this issue really got on the international agenda in a big way. And I thought about it first in terms of Nuremberg and Tokyo's crime against peace. Seemed to me was a good example of a crime against peace. But that line of thinking back in the 70s quickly led me to the conclusion, well, there is no Nuremberg, there's no Tokyo, and there's no way we can really find a forum in which to make those kinds of arguments. Indeed, if you fast forward to the present time, the crime of aggression is now within the subject matter jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, but prospectively from 2018 onwards. I regret to say that Hassan II and most of his advisors are long since dead and not subject to the jurisdiction in any intelligent way. And I'm not at all sure, although one can make some arguments about continuing breaches of the crime of aggression, about whether there's really jurisdiction in the International Criminal Court. So I think one is forced to think about this issue in terms of state responsibility. That is to say, the responsibility of the Moroccan state for what it did in 1975 and subsequent activities. On the other hand, I don't want to lose sight of the ICC's definition of aggression, because in a very important way, it incorporates the gist of the General Assembly's definition of aggression from 1974. And in particular, it's worth thinking about Resolution 3314, which was an effort by the General Assembly to find an authoritative interpretation of the meaning of that word aggression as it found itself in the United Nations Charter. And in particular, what 3314 did was it said there's a presumption of aggression if armed force is used across borders. But that presumption, it says, and let me just get the right language here, it should be overcome in light of other relevant circumstances. The only possible relevant circumstance is the argument that Sandra has already alluded to, namely the spurious argument, totally spurious argument if you read the 1975 advisory opinion of the International Court. The argument that Morocco was somehow entitled to take back something that was stolen from it during the colonial era. Frankly, that argument won't fly in light of the advisory opinion. Morocco had nothing that was taken from it by Spain. Article 3 of 3314 contains a list of acts that I'd like to quote that can qualify as aggression. And this language about act is carried forward into the Rome Statute's definition. Most relevant is paragraph A, and I'll read it. The invasion or attack by the armed forces of a state on the territory of another state, or any military occupation, however temporary, resulting from such an invasion or attack, or any annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state or part thereof. We could pass this finally, if you like: invasion, military occupation, annexation. All of those three describe Morocco's actions quite forcefully. I've encountered one response to this, which I believe is as spurious as the historical claims made by Morocco, namely that since Western Sahara was not a state, once Spain abandoned it, it was fair game to, at least to its neighbours. That can't possibly be right. It was not accepted for East Timor. When Jordan occupied the West Bank in 1949, the UK alone recognised it as annexation. When Israel occupied the West Bank, no one accepted that as an annexation. Indeed, Resolution 3314 itself accepts that a state has to be conceived contextually. It insists that use of the term state, and I quote, is without prejudice to questions of recognition. Moreover, General Assembly Resolution 2625, the unanimously adopted Declaration of Friendly Principles, insists that non-self-governing territories are separate legal persons from the colonial power. And that again, I quote, such separate and distinct status under the Charter shall exist until the people of the non-self-governing territory have exercised their right to self-determination in accordance with the Charter. Western Sahara is entitled to its self-determination, not to be the subject of aggression. Finally, Article 40 of the International Law Commission's Articles on State Responsibility introduces a set of provisions dealing with what it calls a serious breach by a state of the peremptory norm of general international law. That is a perfect description of Morocco's actions, both when characterized as a denial of self-determination or when characterized as an act of aggression. And Article 41 of the ILC's work insists that, and I quote, no state shall recognize as lawful a situation created by a serious breach within the meaning of Article 40, nor render aid or assistance in maintaining that situation. This is exactly how to describe what the Trump decision about recognition means, a breach of Article 1 of the ILC's articles on state responsibility. Thanks, Kate.
All right, thank you, Professor Clark. Now we'll turn to Professor Kantarovich.
Okay, thank you. So as we'll see, I'm going to ask a slightly different question, frame my question a little bit differently. I come to very different conclusions from my distinguished panelists. And I'd like to say from the beginning, one reason I think my conclusions might be quite different is, I think, difference in methodological approach. And as you see in my analysis of these issues, and in general in my analysis of international law in all issues, I am a thoroughgoing positivist, placing huge emphasis on state practice. And what we actually, the law as it is actually implemented in the world, and much less emphasis on soft law instruments, non-binding instruments, and things that may be widely said to reflect customary international law, but somehow don't always jibe very well with state practice. For example, the Friendly Relations Declaration. But let me focus on, let me frame specifically what I want to discuss. I want to only discuss the legal issue, not the equities of the Western Saharan situation. And I want to answer the question posed by the panel's title: should President Biden endorse former President Trump's decision to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara? But I would suggest reframing it. Currently, the United States recognizes Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. It's not President Trump who recognizes it, it's the United States. If that's a good idea, or if that's not a bad idea, or if that should remain the status quo, President Biden does not need to in any way endorse that conclusion. That is currently the policy of the United States. The United States recognizes Western Sahara as part of Morocco. President Biden need not endorse that. The only question, I would reframe the question to should or must President Biden denounce or say reverse the United States recognition of Western Sahara as part of Morocco, which would then affect an actual change of policy. It may be the first time, I think, any territory has been recognized as part of a country by the United States for some period, from some short period, and then unrecognized. I think it would be quite exceptional. But I think that's the way to frame the question. And I would add, currently, President Biden himself, is the president of a country that recognizes Western Sahara as part of Morocco. And so every day that continues, I think, is an implicit endorsement of the, let's say, legality of that position. Again, the question, certainly the United States is not obligated to have adopted that position. And my question is going to be, is there anything fundamentally illegal with it? Disagreeing with Professor Clark, in my view, the law of conquest, the prohibition on conquest, emerges fundamentally out of the UN Charter and not out of any subsequent soft law instruments. The UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force as an element of statecraft, that is to say, the use of force against other states. So the lack of existence of a prior state does not morally justify necessarily the use of force, does not address issues of self-determination, but I think precludes the technical application of the notion of aggression or conquest. Now, that set of cases in which there is not a prior sovereign from a territory that is taken over is, in fact, a very limited set of cases. That's very important to know. It is essentially a self-limited set of cases dealing with a certain class of post-colonial conflicts arising primarily in the 60s and 70s, where there turned out to be a gap between colonial transfer and the subsequent emergence of a state. It's important to know that in practice, this deals with a very limited set of cases, because that addresses the question of incentives, and I think takes the incentive question off the table. Because in determining any legal rule, one has to think what incentive effect is this going to have. Some have argued that recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara would encourage others in, say, similar positions. But in fact, today, with the process of decolonization essentially complete, there are no similar situations that one could imagine, unless, of course, Mexico were to make a move or Cuba were to make a move on the Virgin Islands, which is classified still as a non-self-governing territory. But in fact, it seems that this period of history has played itself out. And now the only question is how to deal retrospectively with the class of cases that arose. So it's Professor Clark pointed out that the Jordan's annexation of the West Bank was not widely recognized, and that's entirely true. But I would also point out, on the other hand, that it was not widely condemned. As a matter of fact, it was not condemned by any country that I know of. So the fact that it was not recognized, I think, has limited evidentiary value, because recognition, of course, is a political act. It's not obligatory. No country is obligated to recognize any other country's sovereignty over territory. It's a discretionary act. And I would point out that on the other hand, the United States has recognized Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, including Eastern Jerusalem, which again is one of these post-colonial situations. Right at the end of the British mandate, the British left, and there was a contest for the territory between Jordan and Israel, rather than the emergence of one clear successor state. So similarly, when we look at how these various post-colonial examples were treated, we see that there is in fact precedent for not treating it as an annexation. For example, Indonesia and Dutch New Guinea, West Irian, was a situation whose factual circumstances are almost identical to Western Sahara. The Dutch colonial administration was leaving. The UN said there would be a consultation with the local people, indigenous people, which was not had in a proper manner, and Indonesia took over. I know of no country today that challenges Indonesian sovereignty over Irian. One might add even stronger examples. The entire country of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, was conquered by communist Vietnam in 1975. This country, with which the United States and many other countries enjoyed diplomatic relations and recognized as a state, its entire territory was taken by Vietnam. The United States did not immediately recognize that, of course, but when 15 years later, I believe 20 years later, the United States did reestablish diplomatic relations with Hanoi, it included in that establishment of relations a recognition of all of Vietnam as under Vietnamese sovereignty. So I think it's also, we need to consider these precedents because one would not want to introduce a principle that would make all of America's diplomatic relations with Vietnam illegal. That would be a dangerous principle, or then seem like we're just picking and choosing amongst cases for expediency. One could add to this list Goa. I believe that no countries in the world currently do not recognize Indian sovereignty over Portuguese territories taken in the early 60s by force. Now, some of these conquests, I think, were not illegal because of the lack of a prior state. Others, like South Vietnam and Goa, I think may well have been illegal. But what this also demonstrates then is that there is whatever norms of non-recognition there are, and I think they're mostly soft law and relatively non-specific, they are not of indefinite duration. Law always puts value both on getting things right and on doctrines of repose. There's only a certain amount one can look back. For I don't think anyone would insist today that countries govern their relations with India with an insistence of non-recognition of Indian conquest in the early 60s, because certain. Yes.
I don't want to interrupt you, but so that we can have questions.
Yes, yeah, I'm finishing it.
The policies, okay.
Yeah, I'm finishing it. So then I would point out, and just a final point on the framing, I think the United States policy is consistent with international law, and I would demonstrate that by further pointing to some state practice that I think has not been mentioned. I'm finishing up now. A growing number of countries have taken diplomatic action to in fact recognize Western Sahara. So it turns out that like about 20 by my count, but don't quote me on that, countries have now opened consulates in Western Sahara, consulates accredited to Morocco. Of course, the opening of a diplomatic mission accredited to a country in a territory is a sign of recognition of sovereignty. So the position taken by the United States is not anomalous and is indeed consistent with, I think, a growing trend in international law and international practice. Thank you.
All right. Now I'd like to give the panelists a chance to talk about the comments made by the other panelists. Shall I just start with you, Sandra?
Thank you. I actually want to defer most of my time to Professor Clark because I think that a lot of this deals with, it seems to me that what Professor Kantorovich rejects is sort of the base notion that Morocco has illegally acquired Western Sahara. And so he doesn't address self-determination at all, actually, because he rejects the notion that the initial act was contrary to international law, if I'm understanding him correctly. Because you didn't mention self-determination. I just want to make a couple things clear. Number one, no country has recognized Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, apart from the United States. Not a single country, okay? That is, you can say, well, they have diplomatic consulate, they have, consulates here, not the same thing.
All right, so go ahead.
So that's one thing. And I just want to say that the position that Professor Kantorovich has taken really does run directly counter to multiple resolutions, which he would, no doubt characterize as soft law, but these represent a very firm consensus that is bolstered by the opinion of the ICJ, the judicial branch of the United Nations, that Western Sahara is a non-self-governing territory and that Morocco's claim to the territory that it invoked to justify its incursion and attack on the territory was in fact not, that claim did not have any basis in law. So those are the 2 points that I would make. And the final sort of political point, which I think will be addressed more by the next panel, is that I think it's important to recognize that there is a broader agenda at play here. What Professor Kantorovich made glancing reference to was actually expressly invoked by Mr. Kushner when he applauded the Trump administration for recognizing Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, which was the analogy to Israel's sovereignty over the occupied Golan. And Israel, like in the Western Sahara, the Trump administration is the only country to have recognized Israel's annexation of the occupied Golan. And what we are talking about here with, I think it's very important to deal with Western Sahara on its own terms without making it sort of a pawn in a larger geopolitical game.
Right. Professor Clark, do you want to make some remarks?
Oh, of course, but I won't quite sure where to start. But let's start with the big picture methodology and the question of soft law, as Eugene sort of tosses it aside. Look, I'm a believer in soft law. I spent a lot of my life representing small countries. And frankly, if you want to know what Samoa's state practice is, the best place to find that is what they say and do at the UN, for example. And I think it's even true of slightly larger countries like New Zealand and so on. The world has changed, and it changed dramatically with the end of colonialism and the expansion of UN membership. It had changed earlier than that, I think, with the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization and the way in which states interact in that way. So I think resolutions like the definition of aggression, unanimously adopted by the General Assembly, 2625, the declaration on the 25th anniversary of the United Nations, unanimously adopted by the Assembly. Ceremonial occasions, the Declaration Against Torture, and one can argue about the Universal Declaration and so on. There are certain instruments that most serious international law scholars, and certainly the International Court of Justice, regard as law. But if you want to go down that direction and think about the norm about non-recognition, it's not something that first emerged in the General Assembly. It's something that first emerged in United States practice in the early 1930s with the Stimson Doctrine and the non-recognition of the puppet regime that Japan had set up in China and so on, and was continued in the United States, a practice with the non-recognition of the Soviet acquisition of the Baltic territories. Indeed, if you think about just giving up and hoping the question goes away, the United States absolutely stuck to its guns from 1940 through the end of the Soviet Union. It did not recognize Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union. It was adamant about it, and it found ways to maintain diplomatic representation and so on. I think Jen is right about something else, namely that if the United States were now to de-recognize the Moroccan acquisition of Western Sahara, it would be the first time the United States has done that. It would not be the first time that some significant state has recognized and then changed its mind and de-recognized. In the early 1970s, Australia formally recognized the acquisition of the Baltic territories by the Soviet Union. New government came along and they de-recognized it. The Soviet Union was not displeased, was very displeased, was not pleased about that, but it seems pretty clear that states can do that. As for Jordan and all that, I don't know that anybody got up and said, we do not recognize this, but it's fair to say that the Arab states, unanimously, I think, but certainly pretty close to that, said, wait a minute, what Jordan is up to is inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the United Nations Charter, namely the Declaration on Non-Self-Governing Territories. And they emphasized the language in Article 73 of the Charter, namely the sacred trust that somebody has in those circumstances. I think it's a decision not to recognize, a decision to say this is a non-self-governing territory, guys, which you inherited. And then you can sort of go down the chain of inheritance, can't you, with the West Bank, but initially inherited from the British in a sense. While we're on specifics, West Papua or West New Guinea, depending on what you prefer, whose point of view you're taking on this, it's not correct to say that the states in the region regard that as a fait accompli and they've given up on the self-determination of the people of West Papua. In the last couple of years, at least 7 members of the Pacific group in the United Nations have raised the issue. There are efforts afoot by what's usually referred to as the Melanesian Spearhead Group, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, to get what is usually described as reinscription, get West New Guinea back on there. There are some intractables out there, and how you deal with intractables is a problem. This is an intractable. The consulate ones is really interesting. Jen, if you've got some treaties out there, agreements, which say we will establish diplomatic relations to the extent of having a consulate in Western Sahara, I'd be really interested to find them. I've searched, and I do my best with Google to find this stuff, and I couldn't find anything. And frankly, it's always seemed to me that consulates is one of those wonderful fudges that you do from time to time. During the Vietnam War, for example, Great Britain, which did not recognize Northern Vietnam as a separate entity, they recognized the government in the South. They had succeeded in stashing a consulate in Hanoi. I was a bit afraid that the Americans would bomb it, but there it was. And they accredited it to the city of Hanoi, just a nice little diplomatic ploy to get around the recognition problem. And of course, the whole Vietnam story of recognition is a complicated story, isn't it? The United States recognized the government in the South as a government of the whole during the war. And then they had a little problem saying, well, there's actually an aggression. Well, if part of the country is invading the other, it's a little hard to say it's an aggression, but there was some fancy footwork to try and get around that. On the other hand, the Soviet Union and its buddies tended to recognize the government of the North as the government of the whole. So that gets messy once the war gets over and everybody's sort of sitting around figuring out what's going to do next. There are some anomalies. I'll concede that. Recognition doesn't solve too many problems for you sometimes. Well, I could go on, but it was very stimulating here, Professor.
Okay, I think that we can ask some questions now. Professor Kontorovich.
Could I respond to the comments of Professor Babcock and Professor Clark? I didn't get my response round.
Okay, go ahead for a few minutes.
Yeah, no, thank you. So first of all, once we concede that there's anomalies, then the question is always, how do you decide whether this is going to be one of the anomalies? And I could say also Western Sahara is another one of the anomalies. And when we're picking out cases like this, I would look to, if state practice does not establish a clear rule, I would consider it non-established. And there's a danger here of what I would call selecting on the dependent variable. We do that a lot in international law, right? We're looking for the keys under the streetlight. So we say, these famous three cases, the Baltic republics, the United States and a few other countries did not recognize Soviet sovereignty over, it proves non-recognition. But on the other hand, the United States did recognize Soviet sovereignty over Moldova, right? Annexed from Romania, Georgia, Armenia, and a variety of other previously independent republics. Continues to recognize Chinese sovereignty over the East Turkmen Republic, over Tibet, etc. So the whether we're selecting the exceptions or selecting the rule, I think is unclear. So I want to address very much Professor Babcock's point about an agenda or using Western Sahara as a pawn in some kind of scheme. I would be really surprised to think that recognition of Western Sahara would be part of any kind of Israel-related agenda, given that, and I'll repeat, dozens of countries now, I believe over 20, African, Arab, have created diplomatic missions accredited to Morocco and Western Sahara. Now you could say, oh, that's different. I don't know why it's different. In Zvitovsky, the famous Jerusalem passport case of the Supreme Court specifically said that the Congress could not require the president to create a diplomatic mission to Israel in Jerusalem, because that would be an act of recognition of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. If the United States had a mission there that was not just a mission to Jerusalem, but a mission to Israel. It seems the same answer would hold to any kind of diplomatic mission. And let me just and indeed this is exactly what. Let me just read you one statement. I have a list. Professor Clark, I can send you afterwards. A spreadsheet I'm putting together. But when, for example, Jordan just this year opened a consulate in Laayoune, I believe, they said the opening of the consulate today is a confirmation of Jordan's firm position that we have been and will continue to stand by the territorial integrity of our sister kingdom, Morocco. I find that hard to understand as anything other than a recognition of Moroccan sovereignty. Also, the acceptance by many countries of at least the Moroccan autonomy plan as a viable and feasible solution is, if not a recognition of sovereignty, then a recognition of the recognizability of sovereignty. Again, such a recognition is not mandatory.
Professor, I think we need to have a few questions here. It seems from the discussion, Professor Kontorovich, that you do not deny that according to what you call soft principles of international law, such as the right to self-determination, adherence to the advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice, the adherence to principles of human rights throughout the world, adherence to principles of democracy throughout the world, all of these things that you consider to be soft law. According to these principles, the people of Western Sahara have a right to self-determination, and that this is not the case today if Morocco is recognized as having sovereignty over Western Sahara without the people of the territory voting in favor of that. Now, when it comes to what you call the hard principles.
Wait, is that a question?
Well, no,
I'm
trying to summarize what the discussion has been. So
because I disagree with your characterizations of my views and what I would think about.
All right.
this situation.
No, I was thinking that these principles are principles that don't necessarily comport all the time with state practice, but are principles that nevertheless a lot of states, including the United States, adhere to, at least in our speeches. But I thought that those were the principles. For instance, you seem to say that.
So what's that? Is this a question?
Well, yes, I'm coming to the question. You seem to say that the principle of self-determination is one of those soft principles that you don't think really has any real value in this situation. Is that correct or not?
That's a yes or no question.
No, you can explain. Go right ahead.
So one of the problems with one of the reasons we look to state practice in international law is A, it is actually a major recognized form of international law as opposed to ideas in the air. B, state practice can give specificity to norms that general principles do not. The attraction of general principles is they let publicists and infer from them a broad range of content to suit a wide variety of views. Whether that content is obligatory, I think, has to meet the test of whether it is actually international law. In particular, self-determination, there is definitely an idea of self-determination. No one doubts that there's such an idea. But what that idea requires in practice is, I think, very not obvious. And in particular, the question, again, we're not here to address the legality of Morocco's presence in Western Sahara. We're here to address the legality of the United States recognition, which is, again, 1 degree removed. So I'm certainly not a supporter of bootstrapping soft law upon soft law. That is to say, the most aggressive view of what self-determination requires in the sense of national independence for various groups, which is not something we see applied in practice, plus a doctrine of non-recognition of a failure to do that is far more aggressive than anything we see in state practice. Maybe we would be in a better world, right, in which the United States was compelled to not recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet and the East Turkmen Republic, but I would be dishonest if I described that as the world in which we in fact live as a positive matter. And if one had to choose, I don't know why I would choose Western Sahara over, say, Tibet.
Well, no one is asking anyone to pick and choose among countries. We're talking about general principles. But it's interesting that you said that we're not here to discuss whether or not Morocco's current situation, occupation of Western Sahara is legal or not, but that is one of the questions we are here to discuss, because that is one of the underlying issues around this issue, Western Sahara, that people need to know or understand to understand whether President Trump's decision should be something that is perpetuated by the United States.
But in my view, even if the underlying conduct is illegal, like North Vietnam's conquest of South Vietnam, that does not make the subsequent recognition as part of a broader diplomatic package illegal or even improper. Because if we were, in my view, if we were to start unrecognizing everything illegal, our international relations would be left in shambles, and we would not have diplomatic relations with Russia, India, or China, which would be not, that's so I would, that's quite a price ticket to pay for principles that are in fact not endorsed anywhere, and we would set ourselves at odds with the international community, which takes an entirely different approach.
Right, Professor Babcock, I think you wanted to say something.
I did, just on the point of self-determination, since Professor Kantorovich is a positivist, I'd just like to point out that it's Article 1 of both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that provides that all peoples have the right to self-determination. And by virtue of that right, they may freely determine their political status. That's about as positivist as you can get in terms of the right to self-determination. You mentioned Morocco's autonomy plan, but that autonomy plan that they have, it's important to recognize, is something that would allow for territorial integration. It would not give the Western Saharan people that right to choose, to freely choose their political future out of a range of possibilities. So the autonomy plan is quite problematic. And I think the other thing that your last comment reveals is that, and this reminds me of something that Secretary of State Blinken said when asked about the Trump administration's recognition of the occupied Golan. He said, putting legal niceties aside. Well, what we're not talking about legal niceties here. We are talking about international principles of international law that are rock solid, that are really the bulwark against international aggression, that are what, for better, for worse, has been put in place, and I think for better, as the sort of the legal structure that governs the behavior of nations, and that has resulted largely in, world peace for the last several decades. And I think that we're getting to a very dangerous place if we characterize these principles of law as, something that we can discard because of geopolitical realities. When in this case in particular, I think it's worth emphasizing that these are principles that have the consensus of the great majority, I will grant you, let's say that there are 10 countries that have established consulates, and consulates, by the way, are not a diplomatic presence, but if they were, they're not. Embassies are political presence, and the country consulates are different. But let's assume that there is some practical engagement by certain countries with Morocco's occupation. That itself does not is so inadequate as a demonstration of the illegitimacy of these bedrock principles of international law.
Professor Kontorovich, I think you want to I think you want to respond to that.
Under the International Covenant, under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, consuls, I believe Article 11 or 12, consuls must be accredited to the sovereign country over the territory. So the accrediting of the consul to Morocco is under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, a clear acknowledgement of, and by the way, it's a very important principle. This is why, other than the United States, countries like Britain, France, Spain that have consulates in Jerusalem do not actually seek Israeli accreditation because they acknowledge that would be a recognition of Israeli sovereignty. Maybe you think they're wrong and that it wouldn't be, but that's certainly their position. Again, I would certainly not discard any principles of international law, but principles are very indeterminate on the general level in which they are written. And in terms of international peace, I don't know. I mean, I would not necessarily advise, if we were to reframe the title of this question, should President Biden reject President Clinton's recognition of Vietnamese sovereignty over South Vietnam? My instinct is that would not necessarily be good for international peace. And so these rules, I think, are written on a very broad level of generality. And in particular, we're not asking about, again, the question of recognition is separate from the underlying question of the legal status. So, for example, I believe the United States, need not conduct an inquest on the status of West Irian to continue not question its recognition of Indonesian sovereignty there. Because, again, I would not heap inference upon inference, that is to say, taking the most aggressive version of the notion of self-determination as the entitlement to a national state of one's own, by the way, which would now also have to be framed in a way to disallow ethnic Moroccans to vote in a referendum. So there's a very highly specific framing of self-determination, which I don't think we've seen in previous contexts. I would add that in East Timor, when they did have the referendum, Indonesian settlers were allowed to vote in the referendum. So this is certainly a specification of the norm of self-determination that I don't think is present in state practice. And then add to that a non-recognition norm that is not consistent with state practice.
Right, Professor, we're going to have to stop pretty soon because there's going to be another panel discussion.
Do we have questions from the audience?
Well, I tried to ask some questions, but I think that all of you were so interested in responding to each other's comments that we haven't had very much time to do it. All right. I think it's been a very lively discussion. We can see that there are differences in opinion, but it seems to me that the differences are basically on the question of the method that should be used to analyze what legal principles are really a matter of law and which are not, and which should be upheld by states such as the United States and which should not, and not an underlying disagreement over whether or not Morocco's presence in Western Sahara is really legal or not. So I will leave it there and thank all of you for attending this session. And now I'm going to turn to the policy issues that are raised by the issue of whether President Biden should endorse former President Trump's decision to have the US recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara. And these panelists in this panel include Ambassador John Bolton, who served as United States Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush, and as the United States National Security Advisor under President Donald Trump, among other high offices, and also served as an assistant to James Baker III when he was UN Secretary General's envoy to Western Sahara. We also have Ambassador Christopher Ross, a career diplomat who, among other positions, served as US Ambassador to Algeria during the Reagan administration and as State Department Coordinator for Counterterrorism during the Clinton administration, and also served as personal envoy of the UN Secretary General for Western Sahara from 2009 to 2017. And we have Elliot Abrams, who, among other positions, was Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Senior Director of the National Security Council for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Organizations, Senior Director of the National Security Council for Near East and North African Affairs, and Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy. In each of these positions, he was intimately involved in policy decisions concerning Western Sahara. So we are very lucky today to have three esteemed panelists who all of whom have had hands-on experience dealing with this issue. So without further ado, I will turn first to Ambassador Bolton for his comments and ask Ambassador Bolton, do you think former President Trump's decision to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara was wise from a United States policy perspective and should be endorsed by President Biden? If so, why? If not, why? And what should be the position of the United States?
Well, thank you very much for having this discussion and having me on the panel, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you and your colleagues. I think President Trump made the wrong decision in reversing what I think was the correct American view for close to 30 years, that the way to resolve the future status of the Western Sahara was to have a vote among the people who were entrusted to make that decision. And that, after all, is why in 1991, when I served as Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, we created MNURSO to begin with. It was an organization designed to help enforce a ceasefire and conduct a referendum. It's in the name. It's not hard to figure out. And the purpose of the referendum was described in the Secretary General's report that we endorsed, which is a choice between independence for the Western Sahara or integration with Morocco. And somehow for 30 years now, we've failed to do that. We can come back and talk about it. But the position of the United States, I think, was clear and correct. And I think for the US to change its view of Moroccan sovereignty over the territory for no good reason makes it even worse. The fact is, I think that the recognition of Israel that we've seen from the UAE, from Bahrain, from others, and I think more coming, and from Morocco, all stand on their own merits. I think the Moroccans could have been persuaded to do this without throwing in the question of the Western Sahara. They came very close to doing it in the 1990s. And I think that this unfortunately shows what happens when dilettantes make foreign policy decisions. The president himself barely knows where the Western Sahara is. I wrote an article after this decision where I recall a meeting that he had with Senator Inhofe, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a great proponent of the referendum on the Western Sahara. And he brought up Western Sahara with the president. I think Inhofe probably discussed the Western Sahara more with President Trump than any president in American history. And the president said he didn't remember it, they hadn't talked about it before. And Inhofe said, we've talked about it before, you just weren't listening, which goes down as one of the great lines of the entire Trump administration. But he listened, but he didn't pay much attention. I am sure, I'm speculating, but I am sure that the Moroccans thought, hey, the Americans want us to recognize Israel, here's our chance. And they probably spoke with Jared Kushner, who may know where the Western Sahara is, but doesn't care about it. As far as I can tell, there was no real interagency coordination, certainly no consultation with other affected parties like Algeria and Mauritania or others. It was a throwaway. I mean, that's the most benign way I can characterize it. And I think it was a mistake from the perspective of the United States. And I am a believer in democratic change, even when it isn't a change that I particularly like. I think one advantage of a democratic change is that the president can reverse the decision of his predecessor in the pursuance of his constitutional authority to set foreign policy. And I think that's what Biden ought to do. Having said that, I don't think he's going to do it.
All right. Ambassador Ross, do you have an answer to the question that I just posed for Ambassador Bolton?
Indeed, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah. No, I feel very strongly that former President Trump's decision was gratuitous, ill-considered, and dangerous. And it's interesting that to date, no other major country, not even France, has followed suit, and for good reason. Why do I say it was gratuitous, as John has suggested? Because the implied transaction involving Morocco's relations with Israel was unnecessary. Moroccan-Israeli relations are long-standing and close, even though they've been mostly out of the public eye. There was no need to jolly them along. Now, why do I say the decision was ill-considered and dangerous? I say this because little or no thought appears to have been given to its consequences on three fronts: the negotiating process, the region, and US policy. As regards the process of direct negotiations between Morocco and the Polisario Front, established in 2007 to determine the future status of Western Sahara, Trump's proclamation is going undoubtedly to further harden the positions of the two parties. Morocco will feel even stronger. This will trigger a counter-reaction from the Polisario and its principal supporter, Algeria. And all of this will render the negotiations much more difficult. Now, in rendering these negotiations more intractable, the result's going to be that the hardships that Western Saharans are suffering in the refugee camps in southwestern Algeria are going to be prolonged. And this is contrary to Jared Kushner's claim that Trump's decision will improve the lives of what he called the Polisario people. As regards the region, rendering the negotiations more intractable is going to delay even further progress toward regional coordination on counterterrorism and other security issues, and toward regional economic and commercial integration. Now, this coordination, this integration are essential for the security and stability and well-being of the states of North Africa and the Sahel, and by extension of Europe. I mean, these are objectives that all the major powers that have interests in North Africa have tried to push over the years and found themselves unable to do so because of the thorn of the Western Sahara conflict. Finally, as regards US policy, Trump's proclamation flies in the face of a long tradition of US support for two principles. First, the non-acquisition of territory by force, and second, the right of peoples to determine their own future. Now, these principles have sometimes been honored in the breach when vital US interests are involved, but this is certainly not the case with Western Sahara. Looking more broadly, Trump's declaration upsets the very delicate balance of our posture in the region by abandoning the policy of relative neutrality and disengagement that has served us well for decades, as John mentioned, with regard to Western Sahara. And in so doing, it's introduced a needless irritant in our relation with the Polisario's main supporter, Algeria, a country with which we have important economic, commercial, and security ties. So for all of the reasons I've outlined, I believe that the Biden administration should return to our previous position of support for the negotiating process that the Security Council has established without prejudging its results, as Trump's proclamation seeks to do.
Thank
Over to
you.
Katlyn.
Thank you, Ambassador Ross. Now we'll turn to Mr. Abrams, and the same question I will pose to you.
Thank you, and it's certainly a pleasure to be in this discussion debate with two old friends and colleagues, John and Chris, although I am outnumbered 2 against 1. I start with the view that autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty, real autonomy, but under Moroccan sovereignty, is actually the only sensible and realistic outcome, a conclusion that Ambassador Ross's predecessor, Peter van Walsum, recognized about 15 years ago. That idea, autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty, has actually been American policy for about 20 years. It was adopted by the George W. Bush administration. It was continued for 8 years in the Obama administration, and then in the Trump administration, although Trump went, then took the next logical step. I think sovereignty, from a policy point of view, sovereignty for the Western Sahara is a bad idea. Western Sahara has never been an independent state. There's no particular reason to think it would function effectively as an independent state. Taking the Western Sahara from Morocco would, I think, help destabilize a US ally of longstanding and some significance, Morocco. I don't really think there's any reason to believe that a Polisario-run Western Sahara would be democratic or pro-US. It would mean, think of the map for a minute. It would mean that Morocco's land borders would be completely under the control of Algeria, because some of those borders are Algeria, and the rest would be Western Sahara, which would clearly be under Moroccan influence. That's a bad idea if you're interested in the future, the prosperity of Morocco, having the possibility of no open land borders to the rest of Africa. You know, those borders, Morocco, Algeria, have often been closed for years and years. I actually think that if it weren't for the Algerian support for the Polisario, we'd already have negotiated autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty. And I don't think the Algerians are in the business of, you know, let's say as a matter of principle, acting on behalf of people, let's say the Polisario or of Saharawis. I think their position is mostly based on the old and very unfortunate Moroccan-Algerian difficulties. I would say that two final points. Why would we say that there should be a self-determination election referendum? Because there must be such a referendum as a matter of US policy now. We're talking about foreign policy. Why not remember the one in Biafra when Biafrans wanted an independent country? How about Somaliland? Do we favor that? How about, I don't know, Catalonia as a matter of US policy? How about Scotland as a matter of US policy? Quebec, where are we drawing the lines here? Why only Western Sahara? And finally, I'd just say something that actually arose in the last panel. It's probably a bad idea for any country to go around recognizing, unrecognizing, re-recognizing, and re-unrecognizing places, which I think is an argument, particularly given the trajectory of US policy, in my view, over the last 20 years for doing what, and here I agree with Ambassador Bolton, is likely to be the outcome here, which is that the new administration does not pay a great deal of attention to this issue and doesn't change the US position.
All right. I'm going to now let the panelists discuss the comments raised by the other panelists. Ambassador Bolton, do you have any comments to make?
Well, I think I'll try and respond briefly to two of Elliot's points, and I think they're both legitimate questions. One is, where do you draw the line on referenda on status? And he named a number of interesting places where such referenda might be held. I just off the top of my head can't think of any reason to hold a referendum in any of them now or in the future. So why the Western Sahara? Because in 1991, we were confronted with a situation that arose in the aftermath of the First Gulf War, where after nearly 16 years of trying, the UN Secretary General had finally gotten the parties to agree on what to do with the Western Sahara. And the Moroccans agreed to it. Let's be clear here. They agreed to a referendum on this choice, independence or integration with Morocco. And they agreed on what the population would be, as reflected in the Secretary General's report based on the Spanish census of 1975. And I remember very clearly in the summer of 1991 or the early spring, Ed Dirigian, who was then the Assistant Secretary for the Near East Bureau, said, look, boy, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, all kinds of things are possible. We think the situation is right politically across the region to get this referendum, and this is one more problem we'll be able to fix in the aftermath of the war. So I was just in the mode then of cranking out UN Security Council resolutions. We put this peacekeeping force together. We figured, how hard can this be? The voting population, as I recall, was somewhere between 75 and 80,000. I mean, really, honest to God, how hard can it be to have a referendum on that basis? And we had all the parties agreeing to it. This is the new UN, right? Everything's going to be great. And by the fall of 1991, Morocco had driven us into a ditch. because they had decided they didn't want the referendum. But that was the point. The reason we decided it was it looked like it was doable. It looked like everybody agreed to it. We had a territory where legitimate claim of sovereignty had disappeared with the collapse of the Franco dictatorship in Spain in 1975. And now we were going to have an answer and resolve a conflict. Why did we therefore support the referendum? Because it made sense in that context. And it still makes sense to me today, because I still don't think it would be very hard to do. But after 30 years, it's not much of a recommendation for the United Nations, but I don't think it has any implication beyond the Western Sahara. Point two, very quickly, Elliot's talked about the tensions between Morocco and Algeria, and it's an important point. And I'll just tell one more war story. In 1997, I accompanied former Secretary Baker on one of his many trips as part of his negotiation, and we met with the new King Mohammed VI in his office, one of his offices, I think in Marrakesh. Very impressive office. Behind his desk was a map of Morocco, in one of those map cases where you can close the doors, but the doors were open. So we could see the map of Morocco that hung behind his desk. You won't be surprised to hear it included the Western Sahara. It also included the western half of Algeria and a big chunk of Mauritania. So, there are a lot of tensions in the region. They're not all caused by Algeria. I think the Western Sahara could be a viable state. I just wish the people had a chance to have a vote.
All right, Ambassador Ross.
Okay, I'm on now.
Unmute. Okay.
Again, to pick up just a few of the points that Elliot made, he mentioned early on that autonomy is the only realistic option. I have to say my concern as the Secretary General's personal envoy for 8 years wasn't in the outcome of negotiations, but in the integrity of the process itself. So I could easily accept an autonomous Western Sahara. I could easily accept an independent Western Sahara, as long as this status was freely negotiated between Morocco and the Western Sahara, the indigenous Western Sahara population, with some allowance being made for the fact that there are now a large number of Moroccans who have settled in that territory. These negotiations have to proceed on the basis that the Security Council set forth in 2007 has repeated every year since then. That is that the two parties are to negotiate toward a mutually acceptable political solution which will provide for the self-determination of the people of Western Sahara. So again, I'm happy with any outcome as long as it results from a genuine negotiation in good faith and without preconditions, and includes some element of self-determination. Now, we heard the legal panel take various positions on self-determination. My view is that self-determination, at a minimum, requires that the population concerned be consulted in some fashion. And as John has pointed out, from 1991 till 2003 or 4, the emphasis was on holding a referendum. One could imagine other ways of consulting the population. In Afghanistan, from time to time, for instance, there was the technique of the Loya Jirga, calling together various senior representatives of the tribal and other elements of Afghanistan. How to achieve self-determination in a negotiation is one of the most important elements of that negotiation and should be discussed between the parties. The fact is that Morocco's never wanted to approach those words, and even worse, used to censor me when I would speak on Moroccan television by always censoring and removing any mention I made of the words self-determination. So, as I say, whatever can be negotiated, I'm in a genuine way, I'm for it. A second point that Elliot made was that support for autonomy has been US policy for many years. This is true, but in a very soft way. Most statements that we have been made at the United Nations by our representatives have stated full support for the UN process, and then gone on to say that the US believed that autonomy was a, I forgot the exact words, credible and reasonable basis for negotiations. Those words were words. I am not aware of any serious diplomatic effort put behind those words. No American went to the Polisario or to Algeria and said, these are things you must do. The words were left hanging. A third point Elliot made was that clearly an independent Western Saharan state would not be viable. And I could go through all the elements of that kind of judgment regarding governance, regarding resources, regarding security and defense, to point out that such an outcome, if it were ever negotiated, would not lead to a state that was not viable. Just very quickly, the Polisarios had successfully organized and provided essential services to a great number of refugees in the camps. And I think, joined by Western Saharans who remained in the territory, they could credibly administer an independent state. Regarding resources, Western Sahara is blessed with ample sources of income: phosphates, fisheries, minerals, transit fees, remittances, a developing tourism sector. Among many states, it would be well off. And regarding the important issue of security and defense, I think the existing Polisario military, augmented with Moroccan and other forces as needed, could certainly defend the borders from incursions and maintain internal security. In the face-to-face sessions that I chaired, the Polisario delegation made it plain to the Moroccans across the table that in the event of independence, they intended to ask Morocco and others as needed to help with defense and security during a transitional period. Elliot mentioned the destabilization of Morocco. That's a judgment that remains to be proven. Certainly the tendency in Western circles is to link retention of the Western Sahara with the stability and survival of the monarchy. I'm just not sure that's the case. There are other destabilizing factors in Morocco that are perhaps more important, such as the Islamist dislike for the rapprochement with Israel. I think I'll leave it there for the moment.
All right, Mr. Abrams, I think you might have some more comments.
Oh, thank you. Interesting discussion. I guess I'd start with the comment that John made. Referendum made sense in that context. That context was literally exactly 30 years ago. And I'm just arguing it doesn't really make sense in this context. I guess I'd raise one issue that Chris Ross raised, or really ask him about it, which is who votes? It is a difficult question. And in the previous session, it was raised. That is, there are now people living in the Western Sahara who've lived there for some years, who came from Morocco. Do they vote? How long do they have to have lived there before you enfranchise or disenfranchise them? Hard question, but there's another question I guess I'd raise, which is, one of the reasons that Palestinian politics is a mess is the terrible thing that the United Nations did when it said that the PLO was the sole legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. That has hurt Palestinian politics ever since, because it's not. And it is not up to the UN to make that judgment. And I worry about that when I listen to Ambassador Ross talk about the Polisario this and Polisario that, because it is analogous, I think. You will have a Polisario government. I really wonder whether there's any chance of having a democratic vote that would remove or be against the Polisario. I guess final point to just go on another minute. Algeria. Again, Algeria is not in this because they care about Saharawis. I reject that notion. To Algeria, the Western Sahara dispute is a weapon to use against Morocco. It's a legitimate weapon, diplomatically, for them to use against Morocco. And they do use it. And they support the Polisario. And I don't know if there's a lot of evidence that they have been, pushing the Polisario toward a reasonable negotiating stance. I find it hard to believe, despite, what the Polisario representatives, again, not Sahrawi representatives necessarily, not the Sahrawi people, Polisario organizational representatives say about Morocco. It seems to me much more logical that they've been depending on Algeria for decades. They'll continue to depend on Algeria. And again, I really fear this situation in which Morocco has land borders exclusively with Algeria and an Algeria-dependent Polisario state, when we already know of the tensions between Morocco and Algeria, and we already know that Algeria has usually kept that border closed.
Ambassador Bolton, do you have any comments? I'm going to be asking questions in just a minute, but I want to give each one of you a thorough chance to talk about these issues before I do so.
Well, I'll just make one comment in response to Elliot, and I think it is legitimate to say that when there's a referendum, which is still practical based on the '75 Spanish census, and I think it's something that we committed to as a country, and our backing away from it is a mistake that harms our long-term credibility. But when that referendum takes place, it's a fair point, and that's why there's UN supervision of the referendum to make sure it's not controlled either by Morocco or the Polisario. And I would hope that if independence prevailed, that we and others would be available to help out in the subsequent election of the first independent Sahrawi government to avoid a one-party state. But however hard that may be, it really is a little bit unfair to blame or to castigate the Polisario when we've had no discussion at all about King Mohammed VI's prospects in his next re-election effort. And when is that exactly? Thank you.
Come on, John. Since when do you oppose all monarchies? What is this?
All right, look, I would like to ask.
My only Wilsonian aberration.
Katlyn, could I just respond to a couple of things that Elliot said?
Go ahead.
Very quickly. You raised the question of who would vote if there was a referendum. Well, this is clearly, if one ever got that far, a subject of discussion between the parties. It would be folded into a negotiation on a final agreement. The other point I wanted to make was we shouldn't assume that an independent Western Saharan state would be more closely tied to Algeria than to Morocco. The pattern of communication, roads, etc., in Western Sahara runs north-south, runs from Morocco through Western Sahara to Mauritania. There is very limited access east and west, as we discovered in the course of discussions on confidence building measures, whether buses could be used to transport families across the border instead of flying them very expensively by air. An independent Western Saharan state would have a great interest in maintaining the flow from Morocco to Mauritania because of the transit fees it could expect to collect. And one last element, which we tend to forget, is that the Polisario's proposal had two parts. The first part had to do with the necessity in their eyes of a referendum. The second part had to do with the very close, what they called privileged relations with Morocco that would emerge in the event of independence. I mean, they kept stressing this in all the sessions that I chaired, and I'm not prepared to just throw it away as empty words.
All right, thank you. I'd like to ask a couple of questions now, and then we can return to your comments about each other's comments. Mr. Abrams, you said initially that you thought that an independent Western Sahara would not be a democratic country. And I was wondering if we can look into that assumption. What if you're wrong? What if we could show to your satisfaction that if there were an independent Western Sahara, it would be a democratic, basically democratic country where there would be a constitution giving the people the kind of rights we enjoy in the United States, including freedom of religion, where it would be a free enterprise, market economy, and that they would be friendly to the United States and willing to help the United States rout out Islamic fundamentalists in the Sahel region of Africa. Would that change your analysis at all?
Sure. I mean, it would be a factor. Neither Morocco nor Algeria rates in the top category in, let's say, the Freedom House ratings, though Morocco's better than Algeria. But sure, if we were creating a state in Africa that would be a model of democracy, I don't know, a new Botswana, let's say, that would, I mean, that would weigh, I think, on any American official. It's hard, though, when you have one organization that so dominates the political life of one movement, to believe that that is very likely. But is it a significant factor? Sure.
Ambassador Bolton, with your knowledge of the Polisario and the Saharawis and your dealings with them throughout the years, what is your evaluation of the kind of government they would likely establish if Western Sahara were an independent country?
Well, I think it's hard to predict with certainty, but I think one thing that we should keep in mind, knowing particularly the life in the refugee camps for all these years, is that there's been an incredible international presence throughout them. UN personnel, non-governmental organizations providing assistance, education, medical care, and the like. So I think the population in the camps, and I've been there many times, spent the night there several times, I think it's more sophisticated than perhaps you might give them credit for. And I think they're knowledgeable. I think they see what the alternatives are. And I think certainly they say all the right things about the kind of government they want. There's no way to predict that with certainty, but I think when you have the experience of a referendum, which I hope will come at some point, that is another reinforcing factor in persuading me that they've got a good shot at establishing a relatively free political society.
What about you, Ambassador Ross? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I share John's view that anyone who spends any significant time in the camps comes to appreciate the very open kind of society that exists, the tolerance that exists. I mean, to this day, there are Christian, what shall we call them? Good workers teaching English in the camps very openly, and there's no fuss about that. There is a constant effort to ensure that extremist terrorist elements don't infiltrate into the camps. One of the beauties of the kind of society that existed in Western Sahara traditionally was that this was a nomadic society, a tribal society, and people generally knew each other very well. And the thought that somehow the camps could be infiltrated by terrorists without the knowledge of the Polisario is simply not true. So again, from the point of view of governance and resources and experience, I think a Western Saharan state would in fact be viable. After all, we have Suriname and Guyana in South America. These are states of the same size and of roughly the same population, and they have no problems existing. We'll leave it there for the moment.
All right. I have another question for Mr. Abrams. I don't think there's any question but that if the United States recognizes Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, it is contrary to the principle of self-determination. All right. There's no way you can combine the two. Do you think that the United States loses something policy-wise in the world if it is seen to reject its longstanding adherence to the value of the principle of self-determination, not for every country in the world, but for non-self-governing territories, i.e. former colonies, in which it has historically only been applied by the UN in the past?
I thought you were going to ask a different question, which was whether John Bolton is jeopardizing his reputation on UN matters. The nature of his discussion here today, it's really shocking. Your question was a hypothetical, but in fact, the United States has recognized. I mean, this is a fact with which we now are dealing. My answer to that would be, I don't think so. First of all, I haven't seen much reaction in the last few months, but secondly, I don't think so because it gets us to that question that I was trying to raise before. What are the entities to which this self-determination right should attach? I think it should attach to Tibet. I don't know that I would attach it, and I gave you that list, I won't repeat it. It seems that the government of Spain doesn't think it should attach to Catalonia. Now, if the United States sides with the government of Spain, are we going to be, condemned around the world? So I think the question really is a case-by-case matter. And I don't think we've done harm to the United States or our reputation by what was done in the case of the Western Sahara.
Right, I'm going to jump in here as change my hat for a minute and become a lawyer. And I could just tell you that there is a difference in international law between the rights of self-determination given to colonies or non-self-governing territories and the rights of self-determination given to people who want to secede from an already established country. And right now we're talking about the rights of self-determination to non-self-governing territories, such as Western Sahara. There are very few left in the world, but Western Sahara is one of them. And historically, the UN has applied the principle of self-determination to countries or territories, I should say, in that category. So this is the only category we're talking about. So does
Yeah,
that
but
fit your
no,
position?
come on. I mean, it came up in the last panel too. What did the UN do in North Vietnam? By military force subdued South Vietnam, which was completely illegal and immoral. The UN did nothing. So what are we supposed to do about it now? I mean, I think, these standards are sometimes applied and they are sometimes not applied. And it is certainly not a regular pattern.
All right, now I'm going to let the rest of you
Can I just make
discuss
one
these
comment on
issues. All right, Ambassador Bolton first and then Ambassador Ross.
Yeah, look, the issue here was, to me anyway, that was critical was that Morocco consented at the beginning. And as I think everybody agrees, the formula for any successful UN peacekeeping operation, of which there have been precious few, is that the parties consent. Morocco gave its consent and then withdrew its consent. And I think anybody who has studied the switch in Morocco's decision concludes they believe that they had made a mistake and that they would lose a referendum. That is to say that the vote would be for independence rather than integration. And they have feared this because they have made it a centerpiece of the monarch. I mean, they have created the condition of the instability that you say you fear. But it's a real problem for the UN, to which there's no solution. That Morocco's got a veto over this, and as long as they continue to deny their consent, there isn't going to be a referendum. So there's no precedent for it at all, unfortunately.
Ambassador Ross, you had something to mention?
Yes. The difference perhaps between what happened in Vietnam and what is happening in Western Sahara is that the UN has created a process of settlement. In the first decades, it was based on the 1991 settlement plan. Since 2004, the UN process has been based on direct negotiations. In both cases, Morocco and the Polisario were willing participants. So there has been a process. And the real question for me is, how can you not want to take into consideration, in some fashion, the views of the indigenous population of Western Sahara? What benefit would come from installing autonomy on the backs of, against the wishes of Western Saharans? You would have, at that point, a very restless population. And it strikes me that before decisions on the future are made, some thought has to be given to the wishes of the affected population. Now, again, in the negotiations, clearly some way has to be found to address the fact that there are many settlers in Western Sahara today. But the principle remains, you should have some way to consult the population concerned before you take decisions on their behalf. And my problem with President Trump's proclamation is that it was recognizing something that didn't exist. And I'm not sure how that stacks up in terms of international law.
Mr. Abrams, what do you think? Do you think some weight should be given to the wishes of the people of Western Sahara about whether they really want to become part of Morocco?
Sure. We get back to the question, which I think we've agreed is a difficult question at this point. Who are the people of the Western Sahara? Not all the people in Western Sahara are Saharawis, and not all Saharawis are in the Western Sahara or Algeria or the camps. So who votes? I think in 2021, it's not an easy question. I guess Ambassador Ross would know the most about this question, particularly the numerical question. How do you define Sorawi? if you are 21 and you are a Sahrawi, but you've never been to the Western Sahara, you vote. But if you've lived in the Western Sahara for 10 years, but you came from, I don't know, Casablanca, you don't vote or you do vote. I will tell an old war story that goes back to the days of Jim Baker. He made a comment to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice that the Moroccans should go along with a deal that would have a referendum occur 5 years from day one, because in those 5 years, they'd be able to fiddle with the population and produce a victory for themselves, which was, sort of the way elections were done in Texas in a few decades ago. This question is an old question, but it may be it is one of the most consequential questions actually, because I assume that we could agree on a definition today that would clearly lead to a Moroccan victory, and another definition that would clearly lead to a Moroccan defeat. So in a way, if you're ever going to have some kind of referendum, that's what you're going to be negotiating about.
Can I make a comment here as the person who was responsible for legal affairs for MNURSO, handling this whole issue of determining eligibility to vote? The Moroccans agreed to a 5-point eligibility list of factors for voting in the referendum that was planned for 1991. And that was the basis upon which we determined the eligibility for voters in 1999. So there was agreement between the two parties at that point. Initially, under the settlement plan that was agreed by the parties initially in 1990, it was supposed to be just the people who were on the Spanish census conducted of the population back in 1994. But it was expanded because the Moroccans wanted it expanded to these 5 different eligibility criteria. So there was some sort of agreement by the parties then. And I don't know whether you agree or not agree that there could be an agreement between the parties now or the UN about who should be eligible to vote. But do all of you think that it is a good idea to try to have a referendum if one can be held?
Certainly I do. And I think that this was part of the Secretary General's report in 1990. It was affirmed by Resolution 690. It was affirmed again in 1997 when Baker negotiated the Houston Accords. Everybody knew that the legitimacy of the vote derived from the 1975 Spanish census. And Elliot, I'll just say, Baker said to the Moroccans in 1997, look, you should have figured out by now how to hold a referendum. Consult the city of Chicago if you have any problems. And they didn't want to do it because they were scared that even with a little help from Mayor Daley's former machine, they still would lose.
Well, my answer to your question would be, I would go sort of a piece of the way toward Ambassador Ross. There's got to be some kind of a vote at some point. The question is whether that vote is on autonomy or is a vote on autonomy or independence. And as I've said, I think that the United States, as a matter of our national interests, should not be in favor of breaking apart Morocco or of a referendum that would lead to breaking apart Morocco.
Ambassador Ross?
Yes, I need to make a fundamental point here. I don't think that the present framework of direct negotiations between the two parties is ever going to achieve a settlement. Morocco is amply supported by France. The Polisario is amply supported by Algeria. And none of these parties has any particular incentive to change its position. As you know, the Moroccans constantly demand that the Algerians open the borders, soften their support for the Polisario, etc. And I used to ask the Moroccans, what incentives can you imagine that would actually produce such a change? And they could never come up with anything. It was simply a question of demanding and expecting a positive response. So the framework of direct negotiations, I think, has reached the limit of its usefulness. And in fact, I wrote the Secretary General a letter to this effect last November, pointing out that he should be consulting with the major stakeholders and the Security Council to try and figure out some different way to approach the issue. Implicitly, this was pointing the way to something akin to the process of negotiation that existed before 2004. And every time I've been asked, well, what do you think a solution might look like? It really boils down to renegotiating or freshening what Jim Baker was proposing, a period of transition where people would get used to each other, and at some point, some kind of consultation. But the fact is, as I say, current situation is blocked. The Moroccans will never agree to a referendum because with the advent of the new king, he and his advisors determined that they were likely to lose a referendum, and they abandoned it. That was a political decision. I mean, it was described as there were technical problems with identifying the electorate, but that wasn't the case at all. As Katlyn has said, there was a process. It produced results. Both parties jockeyed to shape it in their favor. But at the end, it was a political decision on the part of the Moroccans that they would not participate in a referendum. And we came to what we have now. And what we have now is, I think, at this point, a charade. It's bankrupt. And we all need to be thinking about some different way of approaching this desired objective of a solution for Western Sahara that does provide in some way for the rights or the feelings of the population to be recognized.
Ambassador Bolton, do you think going back to one of the plans proposed by Baker would be the way forward?
Well, I think Chris's point is probably correct that the Moroccans are not going to accept that. So feeling as frustrated as everybody does by this, my simple solution is abolish MNURSO. The terms of MNURSO's mandate over the ceasefire and everything else were predicated upon conducting a referendum. If we're not going to have a referendum, we don't need MNURSO. And peacekeeping operations do not have eternal life. This would be a good one to abolish and let the parties contemplate life without MNURSO and what that might bring. That's the only thing I can think of that would sufficiently unsettle some people to get them to pay more attention to it. But I'd be happy for the U.S. not to contribute to MNURSO anymore.
Mr. Elliott, you have any last minute comments about this?
I see we are running out of time. Well, first, I think it's been a good and useful discussion, and I'm glad to participate. It certainly has brought out why it is this has been going on for so many years. Every way forward seems to be blocked for some reason or another. I'm a little nervous about the MNURSO idea because I'd want to think through more what would happen in the 6 months that followed. And if the answer is, well, there'd be more fighting, more bloodshed, then we'd have to be quite careful in going down that road. But I just end where I started, which is that Morocco is an old and faithful and valued ally of the United States. And I think we need to have its interests very much in mind as we make policy on this issue.
Right. do you think that there's any value in our relationship with Algeria to try to keep its interest in mind?
Yes, obviously Algeria is an important, it's not a major non-NATO ally the way Morocco is, but it's an important friend. It's just that I think that they're using the Polisario to get at Morocco. I don't think they have a really significant national interest in the Western Sahara.
All right. Well, we are coming to the end of our discussion. I think it's been very useful discussion. It's very unusual to have three experts who have had such intimate involvement in an issue be on a panel of this sort. And I think that all the audience appreciates it. We didn't have a chance to go through the questions and answers of the audience, and I apologize for that. But I think in general, the discussion has been very clear-cut and very worthwhile. So I thank you all for participating, and I thank the audience for participating as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.